15th of March 1945, a farmyard outside the German town of Wessel. The morning mist still clings to the cobblestones as a Churchill tank from the 6th Guards Tank Brigade inches forward, its commander scanning the tree line through his periscope. He knows what's waiting there. Every tanker on the Western Front knows the shape that haunts their nightmares. Low profile, angular glacis plate, the distinctive muzzle brake of an 88mm gun. A Tiger. 56 tons of German engineering that can punch through a Churchill's frontal armour from 2 kilometres away whilst remaining essentially invulnerable to return fire. The Churchill stops. There's no point advancing. Conventional engagement would be suicide. Instead, the commander gives a hand signal. From behind a stone wall, 3 soldiers emerge at a sprint, hunched low, carrying between them what appears to be an oversized metal flask. They reach a drainage ditch 15 metres from the Tiger's position. One man pulls a pin. Another turns a valve. The third depresses a plunger. What happens next takes 5 seconds. The device coughs, a sound like a lorry backfiring. A tongue of flame, brilliant white at its core, shoots forward with the force of a fire hose. Where it touches the Tiger's armour, the steel doesn't just heat. It doesn't glow red, then white. It liquefies. Molten metal runs down the tank's flank like water. The temperature inside the crew compartment rises from 20 degrees to over 1,000 in under 3 seconds. This is the PIAT's lesser-known cousin, the weapon the British War Office barely acknowledged existed even after the war ended. This is the story of how British engineers solved the problem of German heavy armour, not with a bigger gun, but with chemistry so violent it turned steel into liquid. By 1943, the Wehrmacht had established an uncomfortable truth on every front where it operated. German tanks were, ton for tonne, superior to almost anything the Allies could field. The Tiger one, introduced in late 1942, mounted armour up to 120mm thick on its frontal arc. British tank guns of the period, the 6-pounder on the Crusader and Churchill, could penetrate perhaps 74mm at 500 metres under ideal conditions. The mathematics were brutal and simple. A Tiger could engage and destroy British tanks from ranges where British tanks could not meaningfully respond. Kill ratios reflected this reality. German tank formations in Normandy achieved ratios of 5-1, sometimes 7-1, against Allied armoured units. The British Army's main anti-tank gun, the 6-pounder, was fundamentally inadequate. The 17-pounder, introduced in 1943, was better, but it was heavy, difficult to conceal, and required a 6-man crew. Once positioned, it could rarely be moved quickly enough to respond to fluid battlefield conditions. More fundamentally, it required line of sight and sufficient standoff distance to be effective. In the bocage country of Normandy, in the rubble-choked streets of German towns, in the close terrain of the Reichswald, these conditions often didn't exist. Infantry needed something portable, something that could be brought to bear at ranges measured in metres, not hundreds of metres. The PIAT, the projector infantry anti-tank, filled some of this role. It could penetrate roughly 100mm of armour at close range. But it was temperamental, required enormous physical strength to cock, and against a Tiger's frontal armour, it was largely ineffective. What the British infantry needed wasn't a better gun. Guns relied on kinetic energy, on velocity and mass. Against the thickness of German heavy armour, kinetic energy had reached its practical limit for man-portable weapons. What was needed was something else entirely, something that didn't punch through armour, but negated it. The answer came from an unlikely source. The Petroleum Warfare Department, established in 1940 and headquartered at the Lagonda factory in Staines, had spent the war developing incendiary weapons. Their most famous creation was the flame fugace, essentially an oil drum buried in a roadside that could spray burning petrol across an advancing column. But by 1943, the department's chemists had become interested in a phenomenon that had been known, theoretically, since the 1890s. Thermite reactions. Mix iron oxide with aluminium powder in the correct ratio, provides sufficient ignition temperature, and you create a self-sustaining chemical reaction that reaches temperatures exceeding 2500 degrees Celsius. At these temperatures, steel doesn't melt gradually. Its crystalline structure collapses catastrophically. The Lagonda team, led by a chemical engineer named Stuart McRae, who would later be more famous for designing the sticky bomb, refined the mixture. Pure thermite was difficult to ignite and burned too quickly. They needed something that would ignite reliably, burn hot enough to melt armour, but sustain that burn long enough to penetrate depth. The solution was a compound mixture. Thermite at the core, but surrounded by a matrix of barium nitrate and magnesium shavings. The magnesium lowered the ignition temperature to something achievable with a standard percussion cap. The barium nitrate provided oxygen, sustaining the burn even when pressed directly against steel, starving the reaction of air. The resulting mixture, which came to be known simply as number 76 compound, could be ignited with a 12-bore shotgun cartridge and would burn at approximately 2400 degrees Celsius for between 4 and 6 seconds. Enough time to melt through 80 millimeters of homogeneous steel plate. The delivery system was engineered at the Royal Arsenal, Woolwich. It needed to be portable, idiot-proof, and capable of projecting the thermite mixture with sufficient force to ensure contact with the target. The final design resembled nothing so much as an oversized thermos flask, a steel cylinder, 380 millimeters long, 76 millimeters in diameter, weighing just under 4 kilograms when loaded. Inside, the thermite mixture was packed around a central tube containing compressed air and a simple valve mechanism. At the base, a percussion cap connected to a spring-loaded plunger. The operating principle was breathtakingly simple. Depress the plunger. The cap ignites the magnesium. The magnesium ignites the thermite. Simultaneously, the valve opens and compressed air forces the now burning mixture out through a nozzle at roughly 12 meters per second. The effective range was listed as 10 meters, though in practice, soldiers reported achieving adhesion to targets at up to 15 meters in calm conditions. The molten stream would adhere to armour plate on contact, the thermite continuing to burn through the steel. Penetration time varied with armour thickness, but test firings at the Shoeburyness, proving grounds in Essex, demonstrated full penetration of 75mm plate in 4.2 seconds. Production began in February 1944 at 3 facilities. The primary manufacturer was Albright and Wilson's Phosphorus Works in Oldbury, with additional production at 2 Ministry of Supply facilities in Bridgend and Chorley. Exact production numbers remain classified, but declassified logistics documents suggest somewhere between 47,000 and 63,000 units were manufactured between February 1944 and May 1945. Each unit was packed in a wooden crate with a separate container for the compressed air cartridge, which had to be installed immediately before use. The devices were never given an official designation. Requisition forms listed them as incendiary device, anti-armour, portable, or sometimes just special stores Type 76. Operational deployment was severely restricted. The devices were issued only to specialist assault engineer units, and in some cases, to infantry battalions specifically tasked with urban warfare. The first recorded combat use came during Operation Plunder, the Rhine crossing in March 1945. Elements of the 15th Scottish Division received a shipment of approximately 200 units on 22nd March. The historical record is frustratingly sparse. After-action reports from the period make oblique references to special anti-tank measures and flame devices, but rarely provide detail. This reticence was partly security classification, but also partly because the weapon's effectiveness made it deeply unsettling even to those who employed it. A sergeant in the King's Own Scottish Borderers, whose account was recorded decades later for the Imperial War Museum, described using the device against a Panther tank dug into a defensive position in a village whose name he couldn't recall. His section approached to within 8 meters. The device functioned as designed. The sergeant's description is worth quoting directly. The metal just ran, like bloody treacle down the side, and the screaming started straight away. The psychological impact on German tank crews who witnessed these weapons in use appears to have been considerable. Interrogation reports from prisoners taken in April 1945 mention terror of fire weapons, and several German accounts describe crews abandoning otherwise functional tanks when British infantry were spotted carrying cylinder devices. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The weapon had no true German equivalent, though the concept wasn't unknown to Wehrmacht ordnance specialists. German forces had experimented with shaped charges and hollow charge grenades like the Panzerwerfer mine, but these relied on the Monroe effect, focusing explosive force into a penetrating jet. The thermite device operated on completely different principles. The Americans developed nothing comparable during the war. US anti-tank doctrine relied heavily on the bazooka for infantry and mass tank destroyers for armoured threats. The bazooka's shaped charge warhead could penetrate roughly 120 millimeters of armour, making it theoretically sufficient against most German tanks if employed correctly. There was less imperative to develop alternative systems. The Soviets had extensive experience with Molotov cocktails and improvised incendiaries, but never developed a standardized thermite-based anti-tank weapon. Their approach to the Tiger problem was characteristically direct: overwhelming numbers and the 122mm gun on the IS-2 heavy tank. What made the British device unique was the engineering refinement. This wasn't a bottle of petrol with a rag stuffed in it. This was a precisely calibrated chemical weapon capable of consistent performance across varying environmental conditions. Tests conducted in December 1944 in Scotland demonstrated functionality at temperatures down to -15 degrees Celsius. The compound remained stable in storage for at least 18 months. By contrast, early Molotov cocktails could separate in storage, and their effectiveness varied wildly depending on ambient temperature and the petrol source. The actual historical impact of the weapon is difficult to quantify with precision. Unlike tanks or artillery pieces, these devices left little physical evidence. A tank destroyed by conventional anti-tank fire could be examined, photographed, analysed. A tank subjected to thermite attack was often so catastrophically damaged that identification became problematic. Hulls that had been penetrated showed heat distortion and metallurgical changes that made post-battle assessment complicated. We know the devices were employed in the Rhine crossings, in the fighting through the Reichswald, and during the reduction of German urban strongpoints in April 1945. We know from logistics records that units requested resupply, which suggests the initial allocations were expended, which in turn suggests use in combat. But hard numbers for confirmed tank kills attributable specifically to thermite devices don't exist. What we can assess is psychological impact, and here the evidence is clearer. The weapon violated the fundamental contract that tank armour represented. A tank crew accepted certain risks: high explosive shells, armour-piercing rounds, mines. These were understood dangers against which armour provided quantifiable protection. Thermite negated that protection absolutely. Armour thickness became irrelevant. The thicker the armour, the more molten metal filled the crew compartment when penetration occurred. German accounts from the final months of the war increasingly mention fear of fire as distinct from fear of conventional anti-tank weapons. Several instances exist of German armoured units refusing to operate in close terrain without extensive infantry screening, a tactical shift attributed in part to these weapons. The technology influenced post-war anti-tank development, though not in ways immediately obvious. Thermite itself proved less relevant as armour design evolved toward composite materials and reactive armour, but the principle, using chemistry rather than kinetics to defeat armour, influenced shaped charge development and eventually led to modern top-attack weapons. A few examples survived. The Royal Armouries at Fort Nelson holds 3 intact units, recovered from a depot in 1947. The Imperial War Museum has one on display, though it's often in storage. Handling one today, the weight is surprising. 4 kilograms doesn't sound like much, but the density of the thermite mixture gives it a heft that feels substantial, purposeful. The morning mist has burned off now, that farmyard outside Wesel. The Churchill tank crew can hear the sounds from inside the Tiger, muffled through steel that's no longer solid, no longer providing protection, just conducting heat. The 3 soldiers who deployed the device are already moving back to cover, their faces carefully turned away from what they know is happening 15 meters distant. The Tiger's hatches don't open. Perhaps they're already warped from the heat. Perhaps the crew is already beyond the point where opening them matters. What's certain is that in 5 seconds, chemistry achieved what hours of conventional bombardment couldn't. The mathematics of tank warfare, the calculations of armour thickness versus penetration values, the careful trigonometry of deflection angles, all of it rendered obsolete by a steel flask and a precisely calibrated mixture that turned protective steel into the very thing killing those it was meant to protect. The British War Office never publicly acknowledged the weapon's existence during the war. Classification remained in place until 1968. By then, the specific battles where it had been employed had faded into the broader narrative of the final push into Germany. The soldiers who had carried those flasks, who had depressed those plungers, mostly didn't talk about it. Not from any official prohibition, but because some memories don't benefit from articulation. The weapon existed at the intersection of engineering brilliance and absolute horror, a solution so effective it became its own moral question. 4 kilograms of chemistry that could melt through 56 tons of steel in less time than it takes to read this sentence. The Tiger tank, symbol of German armoured superiority, reduced to molten metal, and something much worse besides. 5 seconds. That's all it took.